Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Sullivan and I'm Project Coordinator for the Wairau Nature Network. So thanks for joining us on this webinar. My guest speaker today is Nathan Burkepile, who is a catchment facilitator with New Zealand Landcare Trust, and he works closely with landowners and communities up in the Hawke's Bay to support practical on-the-ground waterway restoration. So Nathan brings a strong understanding of lowland waterways and the realities of working in productive landscapes. And during today's webinar, he will share some practical insights into restoring our lowland waterways, what works, where to start, how small, well-planned actions can make a real difference over time. Thanks for joining us, Nathan.
Sure, everybody. I'm Nathan. Let me share my screen here. I'm just here to talk about drainage ditches and enhancing them for biodiversity and water quality. Drainage ditches are really cool. They're actually basically human engineered systems that have characteristics of streams and wetlands, which gives us a lot of opportunity. I'd like to make acknowledgments. This presentation is based on a lot of work with a lot of different groups. I want to really lean heavily on the Carrick's group at University of Canterbury. They really provided a lot of the detail and a lot of the baseline information for some of the work we've done. And Waikato Regional Council has been really heavily involved in some of this stuff. So this is just an accumulation of collaborations with a lot of different groups. So drainage ditches, what are the problems? There's a lot of problems we have with drainage ditches here in New Zealand. We got erosion from oversteeping banks, which brings in sediment into the channels. We get sediment loads silting up the channels, which means we got to clean them out regularly. Macrophytes, especially some of the introduced macrophytes, tend to take over and reduce drainage. Weeds clogging up the channels. It catches the sediment, drops it, and reduces capacity. And then we've got nutrients flowing into these waterways and increasing our nutrient loads in the waterways. And generally, they lack biodiversity, and partly it's because of all these issues that we deal with. Again, this is coming from the Carrick's group down in the University of Canterbury. This is what they've come up with. Is first we got to identify the issues that we have to deal in drainage ditches, and we start at the top. And by the top is where the water is coming in. We fix those leaky plumbings and we move downstream. We use that toolbox approach, and this is what today's talking about is those tools that we're going to have in that toolbox. And we've got multiple issues, so we're going to have to use multiple tools in this toolbox approach. Not one tool always works, and sometimes we've got to use multiple tools in different sections. So when we start in the upstream and we won't talk about too much of this, is best management practices on the land to help reduce that load of sediment coming in and nutrients coming in. And then we move towards the drain management of the riparian areas, and then within the channel margins, what's going on there, and then into the stream and what issues do we have in stream. So we're going to start at the top, but we're not going to talk about that good management practices here at the very top, but basically we'll start with that riparian area and work around that channel margins and in-stream stuff. This is what we'll discuss today. But really, the more we can stop nutrients and sediment coming into that riparian channel and in-stream areas, the better off we are. Interestingly, when we're dealing with drains, we have a lot of different issues that come up. Drains are designed to keep water off the land and allow for productive agriculture. But we have issues around flooding, biodiversity, water quality, human health and well-being, land productivity, and climate change. And we've got to really balance these things as we're dealing with some of these issues in drains. And sometimes some win out over others. A lot of times in the past, we focused just on just draining the water off. But now we got to look at other issues around that and how do we improve those things. It's really hard to talk about drains in just a general standpoint because there's so many different drains and there's not really a way of classifying them. So I've come up with my classification system that really works for me when I'm out looking at what GMPs that we can use in those drains. So we'll start out the top. A dry ditch is basically a drain that just takes rainwater off the land really quickly. And when it stops raining, it drains and it's dry. We've got wet ditches, which are basically drainage ditches that the bottom is in the groundwater table. So they stay wet year round, very little movement except for during rain events. And then we've got drains that basically capture streams. And we're going to focus mainly on the stream captured drains a little bit, but we'll talk about a little bit about that wet ditch area. When we're talking about different things, we got to talk about balancing, what's good, what's bad, what works. And we won't talk about in-ditch wetlands, but I wanted to leave it in here. In-ditch wetlands are basically these wetlands we put in ditches to improve water quality. Really hard when we're talking about lowland drainage and especially managed drains by councils and that kind of thing. But we get really good water quality and high biodiversity outcomes in these in-ditch wetlands. So if there's opportunities for those things, it's really worth thinking about it. Resloping the drainage ditches, again, we're talking about sediment and slippage and that kind of thing. Resloping these sides, these drains is really important. We do get moderate water quality and we do get moderate to high biodiversity. Talk about vegetated drain ditches a little bit. This is before we get into the drains. And again, we can get some good water quality and some biodiversity values out of that. Grassed waterways, we'll talk about grassed waterways a little bit. And low-grade weirs, interesting low-grade weirs. We've been doing some work with Catchment Solutions at Massey. And really, those low-grade weirs can really help on reducing sediments, creating sediment traps, but also reducing phosphorus levels. We will touch on those a little bit, but I just wanted to put them in there to show you that there's a lot of tools in the toolbox. So when we're talking about cleaning up or improving water quality in those drains, grassed waterways are really cool. They're just the areas where the water comes off the land. So this one here that we're using as an example, you can see is fenced. What we do is in the summertime, farmer grazes that little section with some sheep. And then late summer, he'll let that grow up and get up to rank grass areas. So in the wintertime, when we get our rain in Hawke's Bay, you've got high grass that actually drops sediment out and nutrients out before it gets into the drain. Really simple, not a lot of loss of land use. And again, we do use this. You can use this for grazing. We just want that tall grass during that rainy time of the year when we're losing sediment and nutrients off the land. Vegetated ditches are really cool. We don't see much use of them in New Zealand. There's a few places up in Northland I've seen the use of vegetated ditches, but they're basically a wide ditch that is filled with wetland vegetation. And again, this is slow moving water, so we get a lot of nutrient uptake. And it's basically a wetland that's in the ditch and does need some maintenance. But again, that takes up nutrients, creates high biodiversity values. Works in areas where you have a high water table and not a water flow through the area. If you got a stream capturing a vegetated ditch, doesn't work too well. So again, the right tool for the right place. So a lot of our lowland drainage systems are basically streams that are captured within drainage systems. So we'll just move on to those and really talk about those. When we're dealing with these, especially in the lowland areas, most of those drainage systems are managed by the regional council. And this is where it comes in really to have partnership with the regional council drainage guys and talk about the options of these drains going across your land, what you can do, what you can't do, and open those discussions. So real quick, there was some studies going on about water quality and how to improve water quality in streams, and they did a survey of all the literature and just hit the ones that basically deal with drains. But if we create a floodplain or lower floodplain in a drain, 81% of the studies show an increased removal of nutrients. Raised water levels within a drainage structure, 51% of those studies showed an increase in nutrient reduction and increase. Yeah, and so there's some options there that we can see some really cool stuff going on. In-stream wetlands, in-ditch wetlands, most of the studies showed that you can reduce nutrients connecting a wetland to a drain system where it takes some of the water in through the wetland and back into the drain system. We're seeing that, again, that positive result in nutrient reduction. So there's a lot of science showing that we can remove nutrients from these waterways. When we want to talk about drains and drainage and capture by stream, we got to talk about stream dynamics and fluvial dynamics. And the one big one that affects drains is this evolution of an inside stream channel. So if we have a narrow channel with steep sides, what we see in streams is you get slumping of the sides and a widening of the stream area and a recreation of a floodplain. And so this is something similar to what we see in a lot of drains. We see that they're really narrow and incised, and what we do is we see that slumping going on, and they're creating a floodplain. And basically, it's just because that water creates a hose effect. It's rushing down through there. You got these steep, unstable sides. These sides are unstable, and this is why we do a lot of work at resloping. Really a cool example of this incised channel evolution. You can see how these sides have sloped and a floodplain starting to form on this. And farmers look like, oh, I'm losing my land, but basically what's happening is this stream was dug up and drained as a drain, and there was just so much pressure it needed to create some floodplain because it was disconnected from its floodplain. So we see that happening. We just got to find ways of reducing that hose effect in these drains. Rebattering is probably our best GMP that we can use around drains because we got those steep slopes and you get this hose effect. By rebattering a stream, it widens the area that the water goes out, so we don't get as much shear stress on the sides, and you actually increase the capacity on flooding, so we can reduce flooding. So when we rebatter streams, we want to rebatter this to a very shallow area, 1 to 3 slope. And then what we do after that is we plant it up in native sedges. This is Caricsecta, but you can use giant umbrella sedge, which is Cypress estellatus. You can use a lot of the other sedges. There's a whole list of sedges. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go. What we found out by rebattering those sides and planting these in sedges, lowland sedges, you can run pivots over it without any problem because you don't get the height, get nice coverage, and they don't require any maintenance afterwards. This has been put in for 10 years and still has not had any maintenance. Really good, creates overhead cover, keeps the stream cold, creates areas for fish to hide and some biodiversity areas. I want to touch on this, even though we can't really do this in a lot of places, but that channel evolution model that we're talking about around the Northern Hemisphere, they've moved into this 2-stage ditch design. And basically, they've widened and created floodplains within drainage ditches. And what they're finding is between 60 to 90% reduction in nitrogen, 60 to 70% reduction in phosphorus, and increased biodiversity in the stream and waterbird use too. Requires a little bit of land. Yeah, but I just wanted to touch base on it because it is one of those that people might want to do on their own, but within council managed land is probably not appropriate, and it requires a lot of loss of land use because, again, you're widening that stream channel. When we're thinking about streams, rebattering works if you got a wider channel where you don't get a lot of coverage if you're planting in native sedges and stuff. We do have to think about planting trees and shrubs on the sun pressure side, usually the northern side, to provide that shade to keep the water cool. Again, this is a 45-degree slope that they've done on this one from Darien. This example from Darien Z. I tend to like my slopes a little less, but again, we need that shading to keep the water cool. Also, it provides that buffer for stuff flowing across the land through the grasses and sedges, and we see that loss of nutrients, especially sediment and phosphorus, when we have a nice little buffer around these things. The wider the buffer, the better. But you got to trade off between productive land and that buffer. Doesn't have to be high trees because most of our drains aren't that wide. The other thing to consider, especially when we're talking about council mains drains, is we need to keep sections in where they can actually get in and do some maintenance work if they need to in the future. There is something to be said. We don't see a lot of drains with a V bottom, but that V bottom does help keep sediment from accumulating, but it doesn't provide a lot of biodiversity habitat. Let's jump into biodiversity a little bit. We'll just talk mainly about our aquatic biodiversities, our animals that are living in the streams. Big ones are our bullies, our whitebait species, as Inanga, and our cora, our freshwater crayfish. Drainage ditches, especially in our lowland areas, actually comprise probably the largest portion of our aquatic habitat in a lot of our catchments. So they're really important to us. They're essential for movements, corridors for fish to move from their spawning areas down up into where they feed. These provide food sources for our fish, aquatic insects, and refuge habitat for our species that inhabit agricultural areas. And we see this in some areas where we see endangered and threatened species like our bittern. They use the drainage just for foraging. We see them moving into those agricultural habitats. Again, our seasonally wet ditches are less diverse than streams, mainly is because they dry out. And they are an important component and inseparable when we're talking about aquatic ecosystems because there's such a large portion of our lowland ecosystems now. There's a little bit of a field of dreams hypothesis. Basically, if you build it, they will come. Doesn't always happen. We do restoration work. We expected all this biodiversity, and sometimes we don't get that biodiversity. Partly is because sometimes we don't really understand the needs and of individual species in those areas. But we got to remember sometimes, our reality and what our expectations don't always match. This is really a cool idea, thing around, promoting adaptive management. You start doing the work, you see what happens. If something's not happening, just go back and investigate what's going on. A classic, you don't see many drainage ditches like this. This is full of all kinds of sedges, unfortunately, some invasive weeds. But really, this drainage ditch here is what I would call a wet ditch. It doesn't have water flowing through it year round, which is why it's so thick, and the farmer doesn't really clean it out too much because it still takes off the water off the land. Mudfish living in this drainage ditch up in Northland, which is a really cool and threatened species up there. So when we're talking about lowland areas, a lot of times our drainage ditches are straight and there's not a lot of dimension and habitat in there. And fish, especially, and eels, need places where they can get out of the current. And a lot of times we can place boulders in those waterways, and still with the increase of capacity, if you rebatter and putting boulders in, it doesn't affect your drainage, but these boulders allow fish to move in and get out of that stream current. And also these boulders provide habitat for mayflies and stoneflies and that kind of thing within those areas. Really, you got to work with council people, especially guys who know what the flows are, to understand what size boulders you need. Environment Canterbury Fish and Game and the Ashburton District Council developed a little guide to putting rock weirs in. Again, this increases the oxygen flows, but also increases that area where our mayflies and caddisflies and our native fish can go in and feed and move up. These rock weirs allow for fish movement through. If they weren't there, the water would be flowing and look flat like this, losing oxygen and warming up really quickly, but just simple things in there. What we're finding too is these little rock weirs in other parts of the world, sediment builds up behind them. And with that locked sediments, the phosphorus drops out too. So we see some increase in water quality. Something that hasn't been done here in New Zealand, but has been done in other places, is creating structures inside the bank. And I'd love to do this one of these days. Um, that fish can move in out of the flow and get away from in the shade and get away from that open water area and rest. Again, a really simple thing to do. You got to really work with your engineers around flight control and that kind of thing, and making sure you aren't slowing water down. But there's just something to be said for that. Dr. Hudson has promoted this a few in his white paper that he did around best management practices in drainage ditches in New Zealand, but it just hasn't taken off yet. But something really to consider is providing that. There's been a lot of work done by Dr. John Harding, Fonterra, around adding woody structure and stones in these drainage ditches to promote that habitat for fish and that kind of thing. Again, it requires sitting down with a professional to sit down and decide what's appropriate and what works and your stream flows and that kind of thing, and making sure that you're not causing problems upstream and downstream with flooding. A lot of our drains have culverts in, and we've got to make sure that none of those culverts are perched and that we've got good fish passage to allow fish to move out of the drain systems up into wetland systems or stream systems above those drains. So I encourage, as you're looking at your drainage systems and stuff, to make sure you've got good fish passage. If not, most of the councils have a fish passage expert on board, and they can come out, and they actually a lot of times will have funding to put fish passage in and assist you with that. So really just have a chat with your council. If it's council managed drains, have a chat with them and say, hey, you guys need this. There's a fish passage problem here. Most likely they've identified it. They haven't just hit it yet because they're dealing with other fish passage areas, but it's really good to keep informed that when you see these things, to let them know. There's a whole lot of resources I really want to point out. The go-to book, unfortunately it was done in England, but it's a really good book if you're dealing with drainage channels and biodiversity, is the Drainage Channel Biodiversity Manual out of Natural England. It's got a really good resource. Or it's allotted in sections based on the type of flows and that kind of thing. Got a lot of great ideas from this book. It's a great little book. It's free. Download it as a PDF. Dr. Hudson's Hill Slopes to Ocean is a little dated. It was done as a best practice manual for New Zealand around drainage management. Has a lot of stuff that we talked about in. Again, it's 20 years old. There's a lot of technology that's moved since then, but it's a great little start. The Carrick's group at Canterbury, University of Canterbury, has a lot of the resources around rebattering, how to do that, what to plant. The Guide to Manage Your Drains, again, is a free publication from the Selwyn District Council, and again, is really good for around plantings. And then New Zealand Landcare Trust worked with Waikato Regional Council around the sedge planting along board drains booklet, which is really cool. It has a really good section on the sedge selection and also maintenance and what chemicals to use to that won't hurt your sedges but get rid of your weeds until you get establishment. A lot of times that rebattering and planting sedges after you get established, there's very little maintenance to do. That grow thick enough that weeds really rarely grow through them, require very little maintenance. So really good resource there. There's a lot of great resources, but these are the ones that get started. Thanks for attending, and I'll move you back to Wendy.
Oh, thanks for that, Nathan. That was awesome. I do have a couple of questions for you. Yep. So how do you prioritize actions, or what is the most high priority action that you recommend landowners do to start with?
In most drains, I think the priority action is, is looking at that rebattering. And if you got steep drains, steep drain sides, uh, they're going to erode and rebatter themselves eventually. Um, and yes, you do, when you rebatter, you do lose land a little bit, but you're losing land anyways because those slopes, those sides are sloping. A lot of times you'll come in every few years and dig out all that sediment that's sloped out and redo those sides and stuff. Just by resloping, you save money and um and yes, you lose land, but you're losing that anyways because your sides are sloping and your stream's getting wider and wider. And so, and it's costly to plant it up in sedges because you're planting at a sedge at I plant at a half meter, 3/4 meter distance, and you're planting 2 to 3 rows of those. So it is costly to start up, but once it's established, your maintenance costs drop dramatically. So what I tell farmers is, especially where they're not in council meeting strange, but I tell farmers is like, well, you start and do sections and you slowly get those established and you just keep doing it a little bit at a time. Eventually you get it done. We do get a little bit of funding every once in a while for it. But start small, rebatter, hit those problem areas first where you have the blanks already sloping and or already sloughing and breaking down. Start with those areas and get those fixed and then move on from there.
And what are some of the most common mistakes that people tend to make early on in their stream restoration?
Yeah, I think one of the common ones and that I run across is they don't um when we rebatter, we like to have a 1 to 3 slope and digger operators generally don't like 1 to 3 slopes. They usually like a 1 to 2, they like a slightly steeper. And partly is yeah, it's just one of those that it's one of those like, oh, I'll rebatter a little bit and plan it. And it does work to some extent, but not as well. Because I just want to save some land. It's not from a 1 to 2 to 1 to 3, it's not a lot of land, but when it adds up, it can be a lot of land. But then you got to put in what's the cost of that maintenance. And like we're seeing in Canterbury, once they get it rebattered and they plant it up, there's no maintenance cost. So you're not hiring a digger operator to come in every year or 2 years and doing drainage cleaning. So yeah, it's an up the front cost, but it'll pay for itself in the end.
I know that's great. Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, if people have any questions, then feel free to email us at warriornaturenetwork@gmail.com and we will get those answered and make sure that the resources are put on our website as well. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Nathan, for your expert advice, and we'll see you next time.